Hi guys, to answer Ra's question, I drew out this schematic of the vestibular system. It's not drawn proportionally or like you're following it through the brain. Just think about the connections and don't assume it's following the pathway exactly like you would see it. Okay, so I focused on the pathways to the cerebellum, to the vestibulo-ocular reflex, to the lateral and medial vestibulospinal tracts, and the vestibulocortical tract. I know we mentioned the reticular formation in class, but I don't really have a good understanding of it, so I am ignoring it for now. So with this example, I drew at the top the inside of the semicircular canals, which is where you're going to get your vestibular information from. And so the drawing, you can see the kinocilium is the thick black line. It's facing medial, so we'll assume it is in the left ear. And also for this example, I said you were turning your head to the left, or you have an acceleration of the head to the left. And with that, the fluid, the endolymph, will, because of inertia, move to the right. So it'll be stereocilium to kinocilium, which causes depolarization. So just everything that's later in the pathway is going to assume that left head turn. Alright, so we have the hair cell sitting in the endolymph, or partially in the endolymph, and it is not part of cranial nerve 8, but there is a synaptic cleft between the two, so I guess there'll be neurotransmitters when the hair cell is excited that will send the signal on to cranial nerve 8, which is considered the primary afferent neuron. In this case, it's bipolar, not pseudo-unipolar. So cranial nerve 8 is going to pass from the semicircular canals out into the bone and follow the internal auditory meatus, or the internal auditory canal, and that's where the ganglion or the cell body for this neuron sits. So I'm going to go with the simplest path, I guess, first. So everything up to where you see pontomedullary junction is going to be a common start for this system. And so we're following cranial nerve 8. It's going to enter into the pontomedullary junction, and from there it's going to take a few different paths. So one path is that the primary afferent is going to go directly to the cerebellum. There's not going to be a secondary afferent here. It's going to go through pontomedullary junction and follow next to the inferior cerebellar peduncle until it enters the cerebellum, where it will synapse most likely either in the vermal area or the flocculus, which means it'll have some kind of effect on axial muscles or head turning and eye movements. Alright, and that's going to be on the ipsilateral side, like we talked about before. Input to the cerebellum is going to be ipsilateral. And that is the vestibulocerebellar pathway. Remember, it's the only one where that primary afferent is basically bypassing everything to synapse directly on the cerebellum. Alright, so if we go back up here, so cranial nerve 8 is always going to go through the pontomedullary junction, to my understanding, based on the notes in Nolte, and then usually it's going to continue on to the vestibular nuclear complex. And this complex stretches from the caudal pons to the rostral medulla. And where I've got the drawings of the synapses here isn't necessarily where it's synapsing on the vestibular nuclear complex. It's just how I had space on my paper. So take that with a grain of salt. Alright, so when cranial nerve 8 hits vestibular nuclear complex, this is where it's going to synapse and pick up secondary afferents. Alright, so we talked about a primary afferent reaching the cerebellum. There's also a secondary afferent that's going to follow along same way next to the inferior cerebellar peduncle and back into the cerebellum. Alright, so the next pathway that I'm going to talk about is going to cause a vestibular ocular reflex. So that's also synapsing in the vestibular nuclear complex. We're going to follow the secondary afferent down, and that's going to go to the caudal pons, where it's going to synapse on the right abducens nucleus. And by right, I mean right side of the head, because we talked about this being a left head turn, and it is going to synapse on the contralateral 6th cranial nerve. So from there, it's going to do two things. It's going to go directly from the abducens nucleus along cranial nerve 6, or along the abducens nerve, to the contralateral eye, which in this case is the right eye. And we know cranial nerve 6 innervates the lateral rectus. So if it innervates lateral rectus is going to contract, and we're going to look right, which is opposite of the head turn, so that we can maintain the focus of the visual system on the fovea centralis. Alright, so we've moved our right eye to keep it focused, and so in order to keep our conjugate eye movement, we also have to move the left eye. The way that happens is the right abducens nucleus sends an abducens internuclear interneuron through the medial longitudinal fasciculus to the left oculomotor nucleus. Alright, so we have contralateral abducens and ipsilateral oculomotor. And oculomotor innervates the medial rectus, so it's going to also pull the eye to look right. So the eyes are going to move together, look right, maintain their focus. Alright, and if you see here, since we have the secondary afferent coming from the nuclear complex, the nerve that is innervating the lateral rectus is going to be a tertiary afferent, but because we had an extra